What's in coffee? Because I see people with saw that, but oh my gosh, I just brain comes. What's the matter? Well, you see. Oh, okay. Just about a month ago, we were submitting one, and it's like, and now we're working on another one due the beginning of March. So it's kind of, I feel it's like good to be involved in the whole process, but it's kind of relentless. But it's like, every month submit another R1, another collaborative group, and another focus. But yeah, to do it. Not big, huge, but it's scary. I won't let you scare through that. I feel like out of anyway, it is office right now. So I'm assuming that
quantum ones actually a lot. This one's meant for
你们可以做起来，我们做。
So it's really good time to make mine now.
Yeah. Okay.
Because you can also actually.
Decorations. Yeah, well, I don't know, I think it'll be fun.
Oh, there's since we mentioned.
One of the stuff. Yeah.
It's like this type of- This type of-
Yeah, definitely.
We've definitely gotten more. That's
Did you talk about the days? Did you tell them the formula? You press B? Okay, so then we just do that on Friday.
good next Thursday.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So we'll have them derive that on Friday and then they'll be ready.
All right, thank you all for coming. I'll start my introductions 1 minute early, so Ralph has all the time we can give him. Because as you know, at 4 sharp, the class here starts, so we need to be out of here at 3:55 at the latest. So today we have our very own Ralf Wessel. But I'm still here to give the introduction. So Ralph did his PhD in Cambridge and did his postdoc in UCSD in La Jolla. He calls the field he works in neurophysics, which if you look on Google Ngrams, started skyrocketing in popularity, the term, just when, right after Ralph joined the faculty here in 2000, I think, is that right? So you might say coincidence, I don't think so. He has done some influential work on visual processing and encoding in the retina, and received a few awards, including excellence in mentoring and teaching. And he teaches here a couple really popular classes to the point that he needs to schedule them at 8:30 a.m. to keep attendance somehow manageable, which I'm really admiring. And now is co-leading a cluster on the synergy between AI and neuroscience. And I imagine that's at least somewhat related to the topic of today. So I'm very much looking forward to the talk. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm glad my CV fits on a little sticky note. So I'm gonna give a talk about the topic of AI and brains. And obviously you're looking at a brain, and obviously this picture was generated by AI, so that hence the connection. And actually, before I give my talk, I just would, if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a picture and of all of you actually. We rarely get such a good attendance, and the funding people, they like to see those things. And, so this is great. Thank you all for coming. The outline of my talk is the following. And so here's the outline of my talk. So first of all, the motivation. And so the motivation is that AI and brains, they have some similarities. And you might simply say there are 3 similarities that they have many processing units. We have billions of units in our neurons in our brain. These units are connected, and some of these, or most of the connections are learned. And AI has similar features. There's a lot of units, lots of connections, and these connections are learned. And some people might say maybe these are the only three features that are common among AI and among brains. And so with that, if there's only three common features and everything else is different, you may want to pose the question, well, if AI is doing something interesting, our brains are hopefully doing something interesting. Can we actually learn something on those two? Can we sort of inspire each other? When AI inspire how we study brains, can brains inspire how we do better AI? And so that is a question that I'm posing here. So what can we learn for AI and brains from the similarities and differences? So not just the three similarities, but also the differences that power their computations. And so that is the question that I'm motivating today. And now maybe you came to see the answer for this question, but I will not give you an answer to this question. I will just motivate the question. And so that's what we are going to do. So you will see this slide over and over again, because it also contains the outline of the talk. And the talk has three parts to it. I'm going to talk about sort of historical evolution of both AI and neuroscience research. I'll put them side by side. And then I will talk about research opportunities for AI and brains here at WashU. And then I will do a deep dive into very specific research topic that we started to do on the interface of AI and brains. And so that's what we're going to do. Questions so far? No questions yet. Okay, so that's good. And here it is. So the historical evolution of AI. Was there a question?
I just a side question. I've heard that WashU is very well known for imaging, for neuroimaging.
Yes, and that will pop up in a moment. Yes, good question. Yes, thank you. And so that will pop up indeed. And so history of AI, history of neuroscience. So roughly speaking, sort of in the 40s, people started to realize that maybe neurons, however complicated those neurons are, we can sort of simplify them as binary units. And so that's kind of nice. Once you have that, then you can put them together and sort of stitch them together into networks and perhaps make some interesting computations with them. And so that led sort of to the idea of putting binary neurons together into networks and make logical circuits and those things. This quickly hit a sort of a ceiling, because once you make more and more complicated or address more complicated problems, you need to know how you make the connections, what values are going to put on these connections. And so people needed something else, and so you cannot just hand tune your networks anymore if you want to get to complicated problems. And that is where backpropagation came in, the backpropagation of error. So these people realized, these authors here, in 1986. So we're doing pretty fast forward here. So in 1986, they realized, well, if we go away from binary units and make them have sort of continuous functions in there, then calculus is available to us. And everything, we can differentiate these functions and we can propagate these errors backwards. So that means we have the network, let's say I'm the network, we have an input to the network and we have an output. And then we compare whether the output is correct or not. If not, then or not quite correct, we get an error message, and then we propagate the error back through the network and we adjust the weights by using calculus. And that's sort of in the nutshell how backpropagation works. So the main point here is that you use calculus and going back through the network. And now you have a method so that the network can self-organize itself towards a problem-solving strategy. And that was a big deal. And so that was sort of probably, I mean, really a big deal. And that now you can start to address complex problems and by having this tool at your fingertips. So what happened in neuroscience at about that same time? Well, and also starting in the 40s, neuroscientists learned how to make electrodes and stick electrodes into brains. And what you see here is a piece of a brain. Inside the brain, there's a neuron, there's an electrode, and a record from neuron. So that was something neuroscience were able to do in the 40s, and went all the way to the 80s. At the same time, people also knew how to do computations. So like simple computations with the sort of recorded activity, and based on the anatomy, they were also able to sort of make little circuits. So that's what you see here is sort of like a circuit diagram of maybe a certain problem. And and then you sort of hand tune this circuit diagram until the model that you make sort of reproduces the recordings that you did in whatever animals that you chose. And so that was sort of the bread and butter for neuroscience all the way through the 80s. And now you might wonder, so where did this go here? And what happened to the rest of AI? How did it progress from here? And what happened next is the following, that the computer scientists realized, well, now that we have this the self-organizing procedure, how the network can organize itself for problem solving, we can actually start to solve a real problem. And the first real problem that I shouldn't go too fast there. It's not just enough to have this. You have this tool of backpropagation that's what's available now here in 1986. But what you also need is more computer power. Okay, so you need more computers. Once you get to more complex problems and bigger networks, you need more computer power, and you need one more thing: data. You need a lot of data to train your network, and so you need computer power and you need data. And so then people came up with the following computer scientists. They came up with this problem. They said, well, at the post office, they have to based on the digits that people write on the envelopes, they have to deliver the letter. And it's a pain because the handwriting, if you look at all the different handwritings that people do in this room, they are all very different, they're pretty messy, and it's a real pain to read those digits. And so that was a real problem, how to identify or how to categorize a handwritten digit into the actual digit. And but there's a lot of data. The post office actually collected all your letters. And so well, at least images of that, and they actually label it. They actually have the handwritten digit and the human labeled annotation of what digit it actually is. And so that is what these guys used here. LeCun and his colleagues, they used that database to generate a network that can do a digit recognition. Now, what did they use here? Well, they used the backpropagation that was invented a few years earlier, in the late 80s. And then they put one more thing in there. And that is an important point now. When you have a complex data set, you can attempt to solve the problem brute force. But it gets a lot easier if you put a little insight in there, in the architecture that you choose, the architecture of your network. And they put a little insight into the architecture of the network. And nowadays people call it an inductive bias. And and they put in there that, well, actually, what almost certainly is happening here is that from the digits to the output of what digit actually it's from the handwritten digits to the output, there is probably a hierarchy of features. So there's simple features at the beginning and the more and more complex features. And so let's assume there's a hierarchy of those features, how they are being computed. And the second is that these features, they are can occur anywhere on this image. And so that means if we make certain kernels that and we get the weights for this kernel here, then we can use the same kernel here as well, or here as well, etc. And so that means you actually don't need independent parameters for every location of this image, but you only need certain kernels. I mean, kernels which you can repeat, and that is a huge reduction in parameters, orders of magnitude. And so this is what so these guys use. So they used so to summarize, what they used is many units, connections between the units, learning of the connections through backpropagation, inductive bias, meaning in this case the convolution. So this is sort of like a convolution, this kernels, and the hierarchy. Where did they get this from? They got that from neuroscience. So inside the brain, the same strategies are being used. And that was known by then, that inside the brain, vision progresses through various hierarchies in the brain, and it gets more and more complicated. And it's also known that there's a certain convolution happening from one step to the next. And so this was an interesting example where neuroscience actually inspired the architecture of an artificial neural network. Huge hit. It worked, and it's I mean, it works beautifully, and so that was great. So what happened in neuroscience at the same time? So during this time here in the 90s, what happened in neuroscience? Well, in neuroscience, they weren't lazy either. They actually moved away from the single electrodes. So in neuroscience, we moved to I was not quite in neuroscience yet. And they moved from single unit recordings to multiple voxel recordings, as fMRI was invented in the early 90s. And so this is a sort of a non-invasive way of recording from human brains. Not exactly single units, but sort of some reflection of broad scale activity. And then also at the same time, there were electrodes were developed, not just a single electrode, but an array of electrodes. So now we can could put an electrode array of about 100, this is 10 by 10 electrodes, so it's 100 electrodes into a brain, and we could be able to record from hundreds of, not hundreds, but 100 of units at the same time. And somebody asked me earlier whether I will talk about my own research on turtles, and which I used to do. And so we actually put these into turtle brains as well. Yes, and so this will be the only mentioning of turtles. Yes, please.
Please forgive
Yes,
my senility and ignorance. Did you say 01? Did you ever say 01? Anyway, that sounds to me like a Boolean algebra.
I'm not understanding.
Boolean algebra, George Boole.
Oh yes, yes.
And I this superficial conception that the so-called neural network is sort of out of date. Now new AI is more update,
Okay. Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, in a way, yes. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And so, okay, so this is what happens. So we have, on the one hand, we have bigger networks, and on the other hand, we have now more electrodes and more data in neuroscience. So that's now this took us into the 90s, and so then what happens in the 2000s? In the 2000s, sort of in neuroscience, things started to explode. And sort of instead of having 100 electrodes, we have 1,000 electrodes, and that's what you see here. And that is what Keith, who is sitting right over there, putting into the brains. And we have population calcium imaging, which somebody mentioned earlier. Imaging is a big field here in at Bosch U. And so we can image the activity of hundreds, maybe thousands of neurons with using calcium indicators that are injected into this or expressed in these neurons. And we can record from those activities while the animal is doing something interesting. At the same time, or sort of in parallel with this, having more and more of this data, of course, the computational neuroscience had to progress as well. And and that is, so computational neuroscience moved big time in the 2000s from sort of analyzing the tuning curves of single neurons into analyzing how many neurons work together to do a certain computation. And so that is what happened here. So in computing, instead of computing with single neurons, is computing these populations. What happened with AI? So AI, so after this success by LeCun and others with this digit recognition, what happened there is actually a lot, but nothing really sort of a big time stuff. And but a lot of things happened, in fact, so much that this book, the standard book on artificial intelligence, had to be updated every few years. And so that's why we are at the 3rd edition here. And in my office, I have the 4th edition right now. And but I'm not putting any highlights in here. So for 20 years, there's sort of like things were bubbling along, but not exactly big time. And but then something happened. Now we're going to fast forward into 2012. And there a new network, not necessarily a new network, but a bigger network popped up. And so these people, and you probably recognize some of these names up there, if not, then I will say something about that later. But in 2012, this network that we found, that we discussed earlier, so where we have a hierarchical organization, and we have convolution, and we have many units, and we have connections, and we have back propagation of error. These people expanded this network big time, and so they expanded it big time. So now what you see is we have multiple layers. So we have these 5 convolutional layers plus these 3 fully connected layers. Within each layer we have multiple so-called feature maps. It's a sort of a representation of the different kernels, and we have a lot of data. We have now 1 million images that are annotated, that are labeled. Go figure who gets paid for labeling all these images. And so that now this network can be trained to categorize an incoming image into one of 1,000 categories: dog, cat, tree, etc. And so that and people had attempted this before. And there had been, so there's these so-called image categorization competitions. And these guys in 2012, they submitted their model to the competition, and they won not just by a little bit. So when you do swimming, Olympic swimming, it's like a fraction of a second you win. They won big time. And so a huge advance. And this is sort of can be seen, and by some people I might see this as the beginning of modern AI. So that all of a sudden there is a network out there that uses some basic principles, and again, what it uses convolution hierarchy from neuroscience, and it can do a fantastic task that is super complex. These are not simple images. These are dogs that are in the forest or whatever. It's not just a simple image of a dog. It's like in the broader context, and yet they are able to do all this. So this is made a splash. It made a splash in the computer science community, and now the neuroscientists, they started to look at this as well. They said, oh, this is actually pretty cool. So this is actually doing a complex task, just like when we show images to monkeys, and the monkey has to do something. And they're using at least 5 different strategies or features inside that we know for sure happen in brains as well. So wouldn't it be reasonable then to ask whether there's any correspondence between a unit in this model and a neuron inside the brain? So meaning, if I show an image of a cat to this network, and I get all kinds of activities in here, and I show the same image to me, to myself, and now we record for me, or let's say monkey, and we record, will there be any similarity between those activities? If not, well, then we go home and do something else. If yes, then we might actually be able to use this network to develop our hypothesis about the brain. And so that was a big question. And so there's many, many reasons why you might think this can never work, because of all the differences between this network and the real brain. ridiculous. The question, I mean, the attempt to compare activity here with activity in a monkey in response to the same image may be totally outrageous. And so there are already two outrageous questions coming up. One for Anders and then one up there.
I mean, if there is a correspondence,
Yes.
how would you evaluate that? I
Right.
mean, in terms of a metric or some similarity, how would you decide that?
And so that would be some activity, like in simplest way, just the amount of activity of those neurons in response to that image.
Okay.
I mean, that would be the simplest metrics, yeah. And
Can I ask, are those numbers the number of units per?
yes, okay, so what are these numbers? Okay, so these are the following. So this is a 224 by 224 pixels. And the same notation goes here. So that is there are 55 by 55 units, etc., etc. So that is and the other numbers mean something else. So this 11 by 11 is the size of the filter, the size of the kernel. These numbers mean actually the number of feature maps in here, inside a layer, and so on. Does that address your question? Right, kind of, right, okay. And okay, so some people were courageous enough to attempt this comparison. So this is then 2 years later, 2014. So this group of people, and actually a number of others did this. And I'm just going to highlight this one paper. And in fact, we're only going to look at this one particular slide. And we will not answer Anders' question, sorry. But they actually did exactly that. They looked at the activity of, they looked at the neural activity inside a brain, so of a monkey, in response to particular images. And then they show the same images to the network, and they compare the activity of these units in the network to these activities that they recorded here. So the metric is actually somewhat, you can ask a lot of questions about the metrics. It's not obvious how to do it. And that's probably what your loaded question was about. And so that it's not really clear how do you do the metrics. It's also not really clear how you actually do the correspondence between one unit here and one unit here. So there's lots of questions about that. But if you do a little bit of acrobatics and doing a correspondence between some units here and project onto here, then actually you can find a similarity between the responses of the units in this model and the responses in the brain. Now you might, okay, so now the relevant question that you can ask, how good is it? Whatever measure you use, how good is it? What do you compare it with? What they compared with is what other models that were around at that time. Is this model at least better than what is around there? And that's actually what they figured out is that this model is actually better than any other models that were on the market at the same time. Yes.
So the input of the neural network is just image. Right?
Yes.
But animal can feel on skin and can hear sound, right? There are many inputs.
Right.
But you say there is a similarity, even though the input is different, right? So is there any reason on that?
Is there any reason?
Yeah, I mean, the inputs are different, right? The inputs
Yes, so the only thing that was is the same as the image.
Yeah.
So they showed the same images to the model and to the brain.
Yeah.
But what you're saying, of course, a monkey is in whatever different state because whatever else happened to the monkey. And whereas to this network, it was only trained on this image categorization and it's only seeing these images. It doesn't know anything about hungry or whatever. And so you're absolutely right. So there are, again, numerous differences between these the model and the brain, yet it is perhaps a reasonable question to ask, how similar is it? How similar are the responses? And so it is this paper and a few of other papers that were published at the same time from different groups that put AI and brains basically onto the map in neuroscience, that people started to take, people in neuroscience started to take this seriously, that indeed we may be able, maybe we have a new tool for neuroscience that resides in looking into this model networks. And so that was that happened in 2014. And then after that, there was this explosion of papers popping up. And so these are just review articles and perspectives on this topic. So 2015, 16, and so on. And there's one interesting, so all of these are review articles, how great neuroscience and AI can work together. And one that I found particularly interesting is how the number of authors for these perspectives sort of increased. And so meaning there was some consensus, actually. It was not just a few individuals who thought this is a cool idea. There was actually some consensus among multiple people that this might actually be a good idea. So that was 2014, so we're still in the history. And so this puts us in terms of the, so this is computing, the estimate computing data floating points needed for training. So this gives you some measure of how much is needed for training. And this is obviously time and years. And this is AlexNet. This is the net that we just looked at that made this big splash. And of course, since then, a lot of cool things happened, like the ChatGPT popped up somewhere up here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so meaning AI hasn't really stopped there, of course. There's a lot more opportunities, but I will not talk about that any further because of I'm out of time. And so now, so that is that completes our history of AI and neuroscience, how this they sort of worked side by side and eventually sort of inspired each other. And so then, yes, Chong.
Very simple question.
Oh,
For the previous slides, like this computation, like power seems grows like exponentially with time. Is this similar to like the Moore's law or something?
Yes,
like
so this is actually Moore's law is here. Then GPUs popped up in 2012, and boom, the whole thing changes. Instead of doubling every 24 months, we're doubling now every 2 months.
But are we? Like, is there like? Because we know Moore's law is like start to saturate, right? Is there anything like that you expect?
Saturate? No, because we have Cater and we have you, and other computers are popping up. And so absolutely. But we do need you guys for that. And, otherwise, you're right; it will saturate soon. Okay, so now we get to yes, Francis, please.
This model of AI and brain made any prediction that then I could go on that.
Yes, yes. I didn't put that into this talk, and but actually towards the end I will make one prediction. And so if you don't escape, I know you have the escape route there, but okay. So opportunity that was you. So what happened at about this time in about 2021? Dean Feng-Yu sort of put up some money on the table and said, whoever has a good idea will get it. And so this was part of this incubator for transdisciplinary futures. Whoever came up with this title should get a Nobel Prize, I guess. And anyway, so we put some ideas, and we put the idea in there that, well, how about we do something about the AI and neuroscience here? And so obviously this image illustrates what I'm talking about. So there's AI, there's a brain. And so Keith, so sitting right there, and Li Kai, who is presently in London, the three of us came up with this sort of idea. And we sort of assembled a bunch of people to work with us on this. So we have 15 faculty working on this cluster of AI and neuroscience. And you might wonder, so what is the rhyme or reason for how these names were distributed here? First of all, notice that there's many different categories, not categories, but different disciplines involved here, from developmental biology, neuroscience, biology, and physics. So Zohar is in there too, who's sitting right there. And so the y-axis has no meaning in here. The x-axis illustrates sort of the interest or expertise. So somebody on this end is very deeply involved in physics or computer science. Anybody? Anyway, And then on this end is neuroscience, neurobiology. And so this is, so the goal then is for these people to work together and do something cool about at the intersection of AI and neuroscience. So how are we going to do this? So the step one is get people together to talk to each other, because many of them didn't even know each other. And so we put some food, some beer on the table, and we had a good time. And so there we are. These are all 15 or actually plus students, and that's me, and holding a cake. So we actually for our first meeting, so we have a little cake, and so we get together. We did that every few months, and to sort of try to gel. And so that's what happened. And so what have we accomplished so far? So this is what we have done. And so we did a bunch of these what we call mini conferences. We to get to know each other and to come up. Is there any ideas, anything that we can do together? And so then, so Tom, who might not be, yes, he's here, Tom. There. So Tom assembled a few people around himself to submit a grant proposal on the topic of AI and neuroscience. And then Koenig, who might be here. So anyway, Koenig assembled a few people to start a journal club. I assembled a few students to teach a class on AI and neuroscience, which I'm doing right now. And some of the students, raise your hands over here. Yes, thank you all for showing up. You get an A. So it's actually, this gelling of people is actually hard. So the ITF is actually doing a workshop on how to do transdisciplinary research, where I have to go tomorrow. And so they will teach me and train us how actually to get all these people together, not only in one room, but actually talk to each other and do something. And then on May 15, we have our first international symposium on neuro AI. We have 10 invited speakers from all over. And then Keith assembled a few people around himself to ask the question, well, is self-organized criticality, does self-organized criticality optimize learning in AI and in brains? And then Zoha is in the fall will teach a course on AI and machine learning. So we are sort of bubbling along here. I don't really have a big result yet or something like this, but the activity is happening and we have some time. I mean, we started in 2023, and so we have money until the end of 25. And so there's hope that we will actually manage to do this. So now I have 10 minutes left and to do a deep dive. And but any question before we do a deep dive into a real research project on AI and brains? Yes.
One question.
Yes, please.
I have a big idea that one summer, some researchers met very informally at Cold Spring, and they exchange ideas. It's completely informal, no written record, and that turned out to be a very important meeting.
Right. So we should do something like that. So, so what's suggested here is that in addition to a symposium that has some structure to it, we actually should just get together and lock a few people in a room and never let them out until they do something good. And we will do that. And I totally agree with that. It's a great strategy, and it just needs a little bit of money and time to do this. And okay, so here we go. The first, the one specific question. So here's the people who got together. So Tom assembled Zhejuan, who is a graduate student in my group, and myself, and asked us a question. And so Tom is right there. And so he asked us a question. He said, there is some really cool stuff in neuroscience happening, and we don't have the answer. Maybe you guys have it. And so here's the cool thing, what's happening. When people stick an electrode into brains, then they do the following. So they put brain, put an electrode in there, and on the visual screen that this animal is looking at, you sort of point, you show some light, some spots of light. And then every time there's a response in this particular unit, then you sort of make a tick mark here or something like this. And then you find, okay, so there's some responses here, but there's no responses here. And then you call this a receptive field. So you call this a receptive field. Okay, so that's they call it the classical receptive field. And so that's what this dashed line here is. So there's a dashed line, and that is representing this type of classical receptive field. And in this case, we put some gray, different shades of gray in there, and then we record the activity of this unit that we are recording for, that Tom is recording from, in over time. And we do that for different trials and so on. And then you realize right away, well, that's weird. So he's doing this here, and he's doing this is for the same unit. And what's happening? Why is this different? And well, this is different because there was what was shown here, what was shown on this image was actually not just within the receptive field, but they showed, Tom also showed stuff outside the receptive field. What he did show to the animal was actually something like this. And so there's a scene that has inside the receptive field is indeed this gray, dark gray and light gray. But the outside that, the scene was totally different. And so there's some kind of a light gray spot here. And then what this cell responds to that, but when you show this scene, again, when the inside of the receptive field is the same, the neuron responds very much less. And this is actually a feature that happens in some neurons in the visual cortex of monkeys. And it was discovered about 20 years ago. And people are this might be important because it gives you sort of like a way of segmenting an image into different parts. And then people thought it was so important actually that they gave it a name. They call it border ownership. That name still baffles me to this day where that is coming from. But it's basically it's a weird response. Okay, so it's a weird response. So how does it happen? Well, it's well known that in addition to the classic receptive field as we described here, these units or neurons are also influenced by other things in the on the screen, and these other things is out here. Okay, so what's the point here? Why am I showing this? Well, it's an interesting, very specific response property, and it raises at least 3 questions. And it raises 3 questions here. One is this actually universal? Is this a feature? Is this a response property? Is this sort of like a universal feature that you will find that will always pop up? Or is this sort of like an Evo special? It's only on Tuesdays and something like this. And so that's one question. So is it a universal thing, or is it something that special through evolution? If then the next question is, why is it there? Why do you have this bizarre response property? Meaning, what is the function? So why is the function question here? And then once you get through this, and you convince yourself this actually is something important, then you might want to know how is this actually generated? So what are the mechanisms that leads to this? To address these 3 questions inside the monkey is hopeless. I mean, it's really hard. And so wouldn't it be great if we could actually address this first in an artificial neural network and then work our way back? And so Tom, Szechuan, and I, we got together and we said, okay, let's find a network. Let's find an artificial neural network that is not trained to have the specific feature, but is trained on something else, but something in vision. It's trained on something in vision. And there was this cool network that is trained on video frames. So the network is seeing videos, and it is trained to predict the next frame in the video, the next one. Okay, so it gets the actual frame, and then you get the predicted frame, and this network is then trained to get really good at predicting the next frame. And this is based on naturalistic movies, and in fact, it's some kind of a camera on a car that's driving around some town. And the network has some features to it. It has total of 4 layers, and within each layer there's some sort of parts to it. What it takes in, takes in the image, and so let's say in layer 0, and then it compares it with the prediction. So the prediction comes back like this, and then it gives an error. And then this error is actually the one that's propagated. So the whole thing is somewhat complicated, and but it's interesting. It actually works. So this whole thing actually works in predicting current frames, so which is why we got excited about this. And then we asked, well, in this type of network, do we find units that have this type of properties? So we take the trained network, off the shelf, and then we expose it to this type of images up there. And then we hunt around inside the network for all the units, whether any of the units in there have this type of property as indicated here. And so then we go through some analysis stuff here. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all this in great detail. We don't really need it too much. All we need to know is the following, is that we found that some 20% of these candidate model units inside this brain have this feature of this border ownership sensitivity. Okay, so that's cool. So now we have found a network that actually has this border ownership sensitivity, the same type of border ownership sensitivity that was found in the monkey. So now we know there is some universal stuff in it. So this is actually something that pops up whenever a system, a network has to do a certain vision task. This stuff pops up. This border ownership sensitivity pops up. So you might call it universal or important or something, but so it's there and it's real. And so now with that we can ask so we ask the question universal. So universal, yes, apparently it's somewhat universal. And so this selectivity for border ownership does emerge in this particular network that we studied. And even though this network was not trained to detect objects in visual scenes, yes, question up there.
Yeah, just a quick question on you identify the border ownership in the predicate.
Yes.
So are you using a pre-trained model?
Yes, it is a pre-trained model, trained but only trained on next frame prediction.
Yes, and just curious, did you verify that if I just have a random network or a network cannot perform the task?
Ah, right. Okay, I see. Good question. And I don't think we did that yet, Tom, right? I don't think so.
I believe that Sichuan tried it a little bit, but that he didn't found that the random untrained network was activated well enough by the scenes to make any sense out of it. So it basically couldn't do it, I think.
Okay, I see. Okay, yeah. So good question. And so definitely we should do that. We should find some kind of a control, scrambling control to do this. I agree.
And I guess, I just follow up on that. I guess if we can prove that a random network does not have this property, that means it must be emergent during the training.
Yes. We are pretty sure about that. It's an emergent property. It just, as Tom said, the data is not super clear about from the random stuff because it was so weird what came. So anyway, so we are pretty sure about an emergent property here. And by the way, we also checked whether these units have other features that were studied in neurophysiology, and they do. And so I just didn't show that data yet. And now we are ready to ask the why question. Why is it there? So now we can take these units with a high border ownership sensitivity, and we can take them out of the network, and we can check how the network deteriorates in its function. So that gives us sort of a first hint about the conceptual function. And then we can dive into the network since we know every connection. Obviously, in these networks, everything is known. And so we can ask we can hunt for mechanisms. And so that is, so this is sort of our first example, how we can AI and brain result how we can use AI and brain results to address a specific question, and in this case in vision research. So with that I come to my concluding slide. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not giving you an answer to the question, I'm just motivating the question that what can we learn for AI and brain from the similar differences that power their computation. And so you might wonder, what is this left and right here? Obviously this is a brain here. And then I ask the same image generation device, I ask it to get me an image of artificial neural network, and in the style of a mosaic. And I thought, cool here, maybe I get something cool here. Well, it's kind of cool, but it's a little bit of a stretch to see an artificial neural network in there. And anyway, so the point here is that in the 40s, there was a lot of influence from neuroscience onto artificial neural networks, binary units, etc., connections, and so on. Since this beautiful network that I showed you that was published in 2012, now we have a lot of influence coming back from AI into the study of the brain. And I hope that we will benefit from that in many years to come. So with that, I stop here and I take questions.
Is there any way to get a handle on like the topology of a brain compared? We've seen these feed-forward networks, and you showed how some things make sense to happen earlier, and then more multiply connected things happening later. Can you see this flow in a brain? And is it an architectural thing that's in there from birth, or is it emergent from learning or something? I mean, that seems like a very cool thing to figure out.
Right. So we know that in brains, this type of hierarchical structure, we have the same in brain. So it goes from retina to thalamus to visual pathway flow. Yeah. So that's the same. What is not in this structure, but what is in our brains? In our brain, there's tons of feedback, and this structure didn't have that at all. So it's a massive surprise why it would work actually without feedback. And so feedback is a major missing feature in here, and which is one of the reasons why we picked for our study this model, because this model, the health one, actually has a form of feedback. So there's a pathway forward, and then there's a pathway back, which is one reason why we got attracted to it. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. So it's a major difference. The hierarchy, yes, but feedback is not in that particular network. Larry.
So early in your talk, you defined the neuron as a binary unit.
Yes.
And as you know, a neuron can have hundreds or thousands of inputs.
Yes.
And the single neuron integrates all that information.
Yes.
So that's, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of neurons that are doing this.
Yes.
So that's a level of structure, right? It's not approximated by.
It is. It is because the inputs, these neurons, these units in the model, they also receive tons of inputs, and so they just like in the brain, and so a unit here would receive inputs from many other units, and so that is the same. That's a synaptic input coming in. The way it's then handled, whether it's in the brain. This is once all the inputs is integrated, it reaches the threshold and then spikes. In here, it's handled in a different way. So the activation goes up, and then people make various assumptions how to deal with it. That's the so-called activation function, and there are various choices what to choose there. It's roughly a threshold, roughly not, and so on. Yes, please.
Okay, well, if I may ask my final question.
Please.
I promise this is my last question. I haven't read John Searle's little book, Minds, Brains, and Science. And before I ask your question, I'll first say my impression or bias. Searle seemed to strongly resist calling a machine as having intelligence. He is of the opinion that intelligence should belong to some organism or living organism.
Right.
So I think that's a semantic hang-up.
Yes.
And my specific question is, what do you think about John Searle, the opinion of philosophy, or he is a philosopher of neuroscience, and his opinion of bias?
Okay, so first of all, we do in our team, we actually do have a philosopher. And so there is a philosopher, so we are safe with that. And so on the intelligence question is this simulates intelligence. This and the networks like ChatGPT and so on, they simulate understanding and perhaps intelligence. It's not intelligence, it's not understanding, but they simulate. Once the simulation gets better and better and better, at some point, is it still useful to distinguish between simulated understanding and understanding whatever you define an understanding? And that is a discussion that's raging through the community right now. And that discussion will change over time anyway. Anyway, so any other questions? Yes, please.
Of the three questions you had in the conclusion, or also before, the why question seems to be, so you had this hypothesis about the why question, but
Yes.
how would you test this?
Right. And so thank you. That's we think that's a great question. And so we are done. So here we are, the why question. And so one thought that we have in mind is what if we just eliminate all the units that have ownership sensitivity, and how would that change the network function? And so that would be one very sort of simplistic way of looking at it, compared to just randomly removing nodes. And so that might give us a clue at what would be actually do. Yes, please.
Could there be self-conscious artificial networks? I mean, the self-consciousness is something
but
that seems
that's in the
unique.
same category of that question over there and the philosophy question. And okay. It's I don't know. So that's I really don't know, but it's a massive question out there. And let's do the last question for Keith, because Keith always has to be boom.
I want to go a little further down the crazy road here.
Okay. Okay.
And I guess my question is, you talk, I like this idea of sort of the brain influencing a lot of this computational structure. I'm wondering if there's actually any other way that these things could work other than converging on a similar set of solutions. Given that we see such contradiction of computational principles across phylogeny, it would suggest, at least from a biological perspective, that there are not degenerate solutions to these problems. And so if we move an artificial system towards the same sort of functional outputs, it would dictate that they invariably converge on the same underlying mechanisms.
No, it's not given. I mean, these are nonlinear systems. There are many ways of implementing the same function in a nonlinear system, and so it's entirely possible that on a different planet, a different universe, there are totally different solutions to this. Did I interpret your question right?
But do we have any evidence of that?
Or we go to the other universe.
Point to the philosopher.
Anyway, let's do the last question because we need to get out.
Could you go to other animal instead?
Hmm?
Could you go to another animal instead of going to another planet? You had your research about monkey.
Yes.
But how about brains of some other animal? Would they do the same thing?
We don't know exactly. So with that we don't know. We stop there. Thank you very much.
6 more minutes.